Well, welcome. I'm Nolan Dalla with another edition of Slapshot, brought to you by Pointspreads.ca. Got a guest here that's I have been dying to interview him for more than, I guess, at least 10 or 15 years. I've known him that long, but actually I've never interviewed Howard David. Howard, nice to have you with us.
Same here, Nolan. Always good to see you.
Thank you. Let me give you Howard's bio. Those of you in the New York, New Jersey area will certainly know the name Howard David. And if you listen to NFL football or have over the course of the last 15, 20, 30 years, you're going to know Howard David's voice if you don't know his name. He was the play-by-play radio announcer for the NBA, then New Jersey Nets, now the Brooklyn Nets, Milwaukee Bucks, the Boston Celtics. He was the voice of the Miami Dolphins, the voice of the New York Jets. Man, Howard, you watched a lot of bad football teams, didn't you?
Yeah, well, actually, when I started with the Jets, Nolan, they were flying. Bill Parcells was the coach then, as you remember, and they had Vinny Testaverde was having a career year. That was my first year in '98, and they went all the way to the AFC Championship game. So they were pretty good.
Yeah, I guess we can remember, if you're old enough, you can remember the Jets when they were a pretty good team. Anyway, Howard was also the play-by-play man on CBS radio, Westwood One. In fact, if you remember, I do, one of the greatest announcers that I would ever hear on radio was the great Jack Buck. And then Howard David essentially filled those shoes. And then after Howard left, after I think 5 or 6 seasons with CBS Radio National calling Monday Night Football games, you were replaced by some guy named Marv Albert. So, boy, they're in good company, Howard.
Well, I'll use the word succeeded. I wouldn't say replaced, but now when I was doing Sunday Night Football with Pat Hayden for about 8 years, and my boss at CBS, Frank Murphy, called me and said, we're going to make a change in the Monday Night Football booth. We're going to replace Jack Buck and Hank Stram after they had been there for 18 years. Would you be interested in you and Pat taking on that role? And I said, let me think about it for a minute. Okay. So, but with Pat, it was a little bit more difficult because his primary business in Los Angeles, he was in a company with some people that bought failing businesses, put their own people in, sold the businesses, and that was his primary business. So he would come to the Sunday night game on a Saturday, do the game, and then Monday morning he would leave to go back to LA. So if he did Monday night football, he'd basically be missing 2 days' work, and he couldn't do that. So they said, well, we're gonna offer it to Matt Millen. I said that'd be great. So Matt and I were together for 6 years.
You know, traveling around the country, going to all these NFL stadiums, calling Monday Night Football, which, you know, really in North American sports is, you know, really probably the biggest in terms of an audience. And doing that for multiple seasons, getting the best seats in the house, watching some amazing football. That must be even for you who has seen and done it all in broadcasting, that must be just almost the pinnacle of the success, yes?
Well, Monday Night Football at that time still had a very exciting schedule that's changed over the course of time to where Sunday Night Football now gets the better games primarily because of the rights fees involved. NBC paid the NFL a fortune to get Sunday Night Football, which Al Michaels does with Chris Collinsworth, and so they get the prime matchups weekly. Back when we were doing Monday Night Football, we were getting the prime matchups.
Yeah. You know, but traveling around the country and watching these games, I mean, it had to have been fun for you. Or was the travel get to be a grind after a while, and maybe just like anything else, you know, it's like dating the supermodel or something. You know, even that gets old. They say that's what they tell me. Is that the case with pro sports?
At one time, for about a 7 year stretch, I was doing the Monday Night Football games. I was also doing either the Jets or the Dolphins, and then I was also doing a pro basketball team, either at that time the Celtics. So I was doing 140 games of 180 days, and that didn't include the traveling. But the good news is that with the NFL team and the NBA team, we were going charter, so you weren't hanging around in the airports for 2 hours at a time before your flight, and that takes a lot of pressure off you, whether you realize it or not.
Those of us who grew up in I guess maybe in a different era, it's all internet now, but back, again, when I was growing up, we listened to the radio, and there was something that was, it was almost like reading, where the imagination takes over, and hearing the broadcaster's voice, in this case, your voice, calling a football or a basketball game or something else, takes us back to maybe the time in maybe the 20s and 30s and all the way up, where people used to hear these marvelous announcers call baseball games, and they would almost paint these artistic portraits that were better than television, weren't they? And there's something about radio that's very different, and maybe even in a sense superior to television broadcasting. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I was a huge Dodger fan when I was a little kid, and they had the best radio play-by-play broadcaster in Vin Scully, who had a phenomenal career, as you know. He was also working with Red Barber at the time, and here I am, a kid that's 6, 7 years old, going to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. And one time we had seats directly under the press box. So when the game was over, we went back upstairs to go to the exit to get out, and the press box door opened, and Vin Scully walked out with Red Barber, and I'm 7, 8 years old, whatever, and I'm staring at him because that's Vin Scully, man. That's Red Barber. I mean, they were legends in our neighborhood because the Dodgers were everything in Brooklyn. And, when they moved in 1958 to L.A., I vowed that I would never root for the Dodgers again, and I haven't. I started rooting for the Milwaukee Braves at that time because of Hank Aaron initially, and then a guy from our neighborhood made the Braves, a guy by the name of Joe Torre. So we started to root for the Braves because of Joe Torre.
Howard, you live in New York, the New York area now, I believe. You lived in Florida for a while. What's your connection to Milwaukee? You talked about rooting for the Milwaukee Braves then, and I know you called Bucks games as well. What's the connection there to Milwaukee?
Well, when I rooted for the Milwaukee Braves, there was no connection. I just rooted for Hank Aaron. He was a great player, and I admired greatness even back then. I admired Willie Mays too, but Willie played for the Giants, and we hated the Giants. So I would never root for a Giant. I'd never root for a Yankee back then. And how things have changed when Joe Torre became the manager of the Yankees. I started rooting for the Yankees, and even today I find myself rooting for a Braves-Yankees World Series. The Yankees will have a real good shot at making it now. The Braves, I'm not so sure, but they have started out well.
They have started out. They're in a tough division in the AL East, but we'll get to that in a little bit. That's interesting to hear you say that you root for. That phrase, I root for. And obviously, growing up as a sports fan, you're going to have allegiances. But let me ask you, and then talk about your colleagues too. Do most of you actually root for teams and players that you're calling?
No, not really. Except when you work for a team. When you work for a team, and I've worked, as you noted, for a few teams, you're rooting for the team to do well because it makes your job easier. And when I was with the Nets, they were awful. My first year, my first pro basketball job, calling New Jersey Nets games, and they had one legitimate player, Buck Williams, but they really weren't very good. They won 17 games my first year, and then they catapulted all the way up to 19 in my second year. So they just weren't very good. But it was near home, so it was easy to do. And then I went to Milwaukee to do the Bucks, and then for three years I did the Bucks, and then did the Celtics for 5 years before I moved to Florida.
It's funny you talk about calling teams, and if you're working as the voice of that team, you want them to do well. I understand why, but again, as a listener, there's really something magical about when you hear the fans booing at home. They're mad at the team. There's disarray, and you've got to call all the games. And it's a weird thing that you're being paid by the teams, I'm assuming, or there's certainly some relationship there that if they're not happy with you, you could be gone. So does this compromise the way you cover and the way that you, not you specifically, but people in this business, that they have to say nice things or maybe can't express the anger or disappointment that most of the fans that are listening feel toward these franchises that are losers?
Yeah, it's commonplace, particularly now, that most broadcasters work directly for the team as opposed to the station or the network. A couple of things happened along the way. When I was in Boston, Rick Pitino was coaching the Celtics, and Rick was actually the one that hired me. So I had no problems, calling the games. Then I was excited to be in Boston because it's a great sports town, and the Celtics are very big in Boston, as you can imagine. So Rick came to Boston, and he had one of the players that he drafted was a guy that played for him at Kentucky named Ron Mercer, who's a good player, but he wasn't a great player. And they drafted Chauncey Billups and Ron Mercer that year and lost out on Tim Duncan, which was probably the reason why Pitino wanted to come to Boston anyway, because they had 2 lottery picks. So we're doing a game, and I forget what city. And Mercer comes down on a 1-on-3 break, and 3 defenders against him, and he put up an ill-advised shot. And on the air I said, I don't think that Mercer would pass the salt at Thanksgiving dinner. So I didn't think anything of it. Celtics go on to play in Utah, and I get up one morning. I'm getting ready to leave my room about 8 o'clock. My room phone rings, and it's Coach Pitino. He said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I was going downstairs to get some breakfast." He says, "Let's have a cup of coffee. I want to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay." I go downstairs. I meet with him. He said, "I got a complaint." I said, "Okay." From? Jim O'Brien was one of his assistant coaches. His wife complained over what I said about Ron Mercer.
Oh no!
So he's telling me the story, and he's chuckling as he's telling me the story. I said, "Was I right?" He goes, "Yeah, but you got to take the pressure off me. I've got to answer her because it's polite." So I think there's probably another way you could say it. And so I said, "Coach, you know that I want to see the team win because it makes my job easier." He goes, "No, I appreciate that. But just in the same set of circumstances, again, you might want to say it a different way." I said, "Okay, point taken." And that was the only time in my career that I've ever been called on the carpet over something that I said.
I have to ask you before we talk about the present and the future. I have to go back in the past because I'm such a fan of this man I'm about to bring up. And I want to know if you knew him, if you worked with him ever, or certainly you knew of him and heard him. And that's Marty Glickman, the great New York area broadcaster who was in the 1936 Olympic Games, was the voice of the New York Jets, as you were. I could fill in an amazing resume for Marty Glickman, who I think passed away about 17, 18 years ago. Anyway, HBO has a show on that, documentary on Marty Glickman's life that I encourage all listeners and viewers here to watch. It's just a fascinating story about a man who overcame a hell of a lot and passed away. Did you know Marty Glickman?
I knew him, but not. I didn't go to Syracuse. Marv Albert did go to Syracuse. Ian Eagle went to Syracuse. Len Berman, who was in New York, went to Syracuse. A lot of broadcasters have gone to Syracuse. I did not. So Marty was like the godfather to those guys. He knew who these guys were, and he kind of mentored them along the way. So I'm doing a game at Madison Square Garden. The Celtics are playing the Knicks. And the visitors' radio booth is right above the exit, just maybe 15 rows from the court. Great vantage point. And I'm calling the game with Cedric Maxwell, my partner. And to the left of me, I see Red Auerbach sitting with Marty Glickman. They were boyhood friends. They've known each other for years. Halftime comes. Marty leans over, touches my shoulder and said, "Howard, I'm Marty Glickman." I said, "Yeah, I know who you are. It's the first time we've met." He said, "I just want to tell you that I've been listening to you in the first half. You do a great job."
Wow.
I said, "Well, coming from you, that means something to me."
Yeah.
And Red leans over and he says, What do you expect? He works for us. So, and of course, Red had the great Johnny Most doing Celtic games for all those years, and Red was Johnny Most was an unashamed homer, and everybody knew it. The Celtics were the team that never committed a foul under Johnny Most, you know. So I said, thanks, Marty. I really appreciate the compliment. So that was the first time that I met Marty, and then I'm going to say maybe 3 or 4 years later, I get hired to do the television on MSG Network for the Millrose Games, a track and field event. And as you already indicated, Marty ran in the Olympics in 1936, so he was an aficionado about track and field. They had me working with Marty. Well, it was a big kick for me. First of all, working out of Madison Square Garden because I was born in New York, and that was a big deal. And working with Marty was very big for me. So it was a pleasure, and so that might have been the last time that I saw Marty Glickman before he passed away.
I'm here, Nolan Dalla on Slapshot, talking to Howard David, a great career in broadcasting that goes back to, I guess, the 1960s and 70s, and has been 50 years in the industry. Calling games mostly on radio, but has done a lot in sports. And, I remember one time you invited me to a game. Actually, you talk about one of the highlights of my life was I was invited by you, Howard, to sit in the press box next to you while you called a New Orleans Saints game in the Superdome. You talk about a great pleasure and something that I'll never forget. My wife and I got to sit next to Howard as you're calling out a national game on CBS radio. I mean, it's one thing to go to a football game. It's another thing to sit there in the best seats in the house and listen to the best announcer, calling out a game. So I'll never forget that. Now, you've seen it all in a sense in sports. What is your greatest, if you could boil it down to one or maybe two, your greatest memories of you calling things that you saw and you say, wow, I may not see that again?
It's easy for me to call the most impactful game that I've ever done was my first Super Bowl, which coincidentally was in the Superdome in New Orleans. It was 1996. The Green Bay Packers were playing the New England Patriots, and Bill Parcells, who I knew from his days with the Giants, was the coach of the Patriots at the time, and that was Brett Favre's first Super Bowl win, his only Super Bowl win. And that was a game where Desmond Howard ran back a kickoff 97 yards for a touchdown, and my call was heard for the next week. I heard it on every radio station. And it wasn't rehearsed, and I'm telling you the honest truth. I didn't rehearse it. I just said Desmond Howard to the 20, the 30, 40, midfield, down the left sideline. Desmond Howard looking at the Patriots in his rearview mirror for a touchdown. And it was memorable to me, and I didn't rehearse it. It just came out. But forgetting the game, a very humorous thing happened before the game. It was my first Super Bowl, so I wasn't nervous. I was anxious, and I was excited about doing my first Super Bowl and work with Matt Millen. And we walked over from Bourbon Street to the Superdome. Got there 3 hours before the game, and Matt goes down on the field. I said, I'm going to go up to the booth, put my stuff away, and I'll come down in a little bit. I go up to the booth, put my stuff where we were going to broadcast the game from, and was looking for another booth where I could quietly just sit by myself and gather my thoughts. So I walk into this booth that was empty, and I'm sitting there, and the door opens, and it's Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner of the NFL. I didn't realize that I'd walked into the commissioner's box. And he didn't have a problem with it, because I knew him, he knew me. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm just sitting there collecting my thoughts, Paul, and I hope you don't mind. I said, I'll get out in a little. He said, no, stay there. I'm going to go get some coffee. You want one? I said, that'd be great. He walks out.
The NFL commissioner's getting you coffee.
Yeah, he asked me if I wanted a cup of coffee. I said, okay. So now I'm sitting there. The door opens again, and it's a guy named Val Pinchbeck. Val Pinchbeck was the head of broadcasting for the NFL for a long time. He has since passed away. But Val walks into the booth and says, Howard, what are you doing here? I said, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts, Val. And He says, it's a commissioner's box. I said, I just found that out because Paul was just here, but he's going to come back in a few minutes. So Paul comes back in. He's got 2 cups of coffee. He puts one down in front of me and takes the other cup of coffee. Val looks at me and he goes, man, I didn't realize how much juice you really had. So that's the way that day started out for me. It was great. And it ended even on a higher note, if you can believe that. Frank Murphy from CBS Radio, my boss, they used to broadcast one night a week from the House of Blues in New Orleans as part of the network programming. And so Frank arranged for all of us to go to the House of Blues after the game. And first I begged off. My wife was with me and my daughter was with me. At first I begged out because I was so mentally fatigued from the game and the pressure that I put on myself that I kind of asked out of not going. He said, now come on, you got to go. You got to go. It's great. You'll enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. So okay. Well, I go to the House of Blues with everybody. We go up right above the stage. There's like maybe a VIP area per se. And the Neville brothers were performing there, I guess, as they've done like all the time. But John Goodman and John Belushi were the Blues brothers, and they were performing.
Wow.
So we're up there and having a good time and laughing and carrying on. For some reason, I look to my right, and who's standing next to me but Denzel Washington? And I looked at him and I said, hey, didn't you used to be? He goes, no, I still am. We had a nice chat, and it was all great because I've always admired him. I think he's probably as great an actor as there ever has been in our lifetime. But it was a great night, great day, great weekend. I mean, it was a memorable moment. I don't think anything can top that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it gets better than the NFL commissioner bringing you coffee in his private box, calling a Super Bowl game, making one of the most quintessential broadcasting moments that's repeated nationally over the next week, and then watching the Blues Brothers at the time perform live and talking to Denzel Washington. Man, what you had for lunch? I mean, anyway,
whatever it is, I'll pass it around.
For sure. Let me have some of that. You've interviewed a lot of people as well, and in fact, you interview people now on your Twitch show that's I think daily, or it's certainly several times a week. And if you're listening to me now, don't shut this off quite yet, but afterward you can go visit Howard and listen to his show or watch old shows, as I've done. I've actually gone back and looked at some of your archival material on some of your Twitch cast. Is that the right word? Anyway, Twitch is a new thing to me. So I have to roll all the way back to, you said you called games back, 50 years ago, and you've interviewed a lot of people as well. Who's some of the better interviews that you've done that were just maybe a bit surprising to you, where you said, wow, there was a lot more depth there than maybe I realized? Your best interview.
I've been in business since 1970 when I came out of the Air Force from Armed Forces Radio, actually over in Libya. And then I got my first commercial job in Princeton, New Jersey. And while I was at this radio station in Princeton, my boss comes down to me and he says, Muhammed Ali is going to Trenton High School for a sickle cell anemia benefit, and there's going to be like 10,000 people there to listen to him speak. So it was a really hot day. It was about 90 degrees. And they said that the sponsor, Budweiser, supplied the place with a trailer, air-conditioned trailer, and I could do the interview with Ali in the trailer. I said, that's great. So I go over there, and the place is packed. There's at least 10,000 people there waiting for Ali to speak.
I'm sorry, this is 1970. Has he reclaimed the championship at this point or not?
Had not fought Joe Frazier yet, the first time. And so I go into the trailer, and maybe 5 minutes later the door opens, and here comes Muhammad Ali into the trailer. He's introduced to me to him. We shake each other's hands. We sit down. Nolan, I have a tape of that interview. That's the dumbest interview I've ever done or heard. Here's how it went. I started out with the first question. I said, is it fair to say that sickle cell has killed more African Americans than anything else? He said, no. Ignorance is. And my eyes opened up, and how do you follow that?
Yeah.
I mean, this is Muhammad Ali, one of the best known figures in the world, and he gives you an answer that had so much meat to it, and I didn't know where to go with it. So I probably stammered and trying to collect my thoughts. And then the interview went fine from there. But you know what was great about him? He saw that I was struggling. He knew that I was a beginner, that I was in my first year of broadcasting. And he was so understanding and so kind to me during that interview. And when it was all over, he said, I said, champ, thank you. Thank you for being understanding. He says, how long have you been in the business? I said, about 6 months. He goes, well, I knew that. But as it went along, you got better and better, and you're going to be good. I could tell you're going to be good. This is from Muhammad Ali.
Wow.
You know, one of 5 people in my life whose paths have crossed mine that had an impact on me.
Wow, that's a hell of a story. I've got to get into some more controversial topics now because you've never swayed from controversy. Certainly not for those of you that are listening to me. Follow Howard on Facebook and other social media platforms because he's certainly outspoken as well. And we need a lot more of that. So let's get into people that are outspoken in broadcasting again, and you are one of them. Basically, this has been a sector that has been dominated largely by, older white people, and a lot of people from the Northeast. So we're now seeing some changes, and then they've started very late. They probably should have started a long time ago. We're seeing certainly more minorities, people of color in broadcasting. Even women now are calling, doing play-by-play, which, just didn't happen for a long time. Talk about that, and I think that you're going to agree that's a good thing. How does that change things? Most of the viewers now are not older white men, and so they're speaking now to an audience that's much more diverse than it was, say, back in the when you and I were growing up. Talk about that topic, if you will, Howard.
Coincidentally, 3 or 4 days ago, I interviewed a woman named Sarah Kustak. Sarah does the analysis for Brooklyn Nets television with Ian Eagle, who most people know from his network work at CBS. And I had Sarah on as my guest. She's the first female analyst of an NBA game on a full-time basis. And I said to her, I was familiar with people like Leslie Visser, who started in broadcasting, Susan Waldman, who does radio. She does the Yankee games now on radio as the analyst. But she was doing talk at WFAN in New York when no one even knew what sports talk radio was. It was the beginning. So I said to Sarah, I said, are we going to come to a day where people are not going to say, she's the first woman that, she's the first woman that, she's the first black female that? Are we ever going to come to that day? She goes, I hope so, but I see some avenues opening that weren't there before. And to kind of add to your first statement, I think there's only 1 or 2. Beth Moen's name comes to mind at ESPN. She does play-by-play on football. And then maybe there's 1 or 2 others, but I'm not sure. There's not many. But I've been around Jackie McMullen, who's at ESPN, and Leslie Visser I mentioned, and Susan Waldman. These are all groundbreakers. They've kicked the door down that was dominated by men.
Yeah, and I remember Phyllis George, who passed away about 3 or 4 months ago. Now, she was there. I don't think there's any question she was there because she was a pretty face on NFL Today with Brent Musburger and Irv Cross and Jimmy the Greek back in the 70s. People called her a groundbreaker, but in the sense that she didn't do play-by-play or was not an analyst. And Robin Roberts was probably a figure for ESPN who broke a lot of barriers just as that anchor, almost I hate to use a Walter Cronkite type figure, but she had that kind of command presence and delivery. And then Susie Colbert, who's been around for about 25, 30 years on, I think NFL Network and ESPN as well. I'm not sure there's a better, there's a lot of good NFL analysts, but she's among the top 10, maybe top 5, Susie Colbert. So we are seeing we are seeing, I think, a time now where people are saying, "Oh, she's a woman announcer," or "It's a black announcer," or this or that. I think we are headed in the right direction for sure, Howard. Yes.
Yeah, there's no question. I know Susie for a long time. When I was doing Sunday Night Football, she was doing sideline reporting for the Sunday Night crew. Mike Patrick, Joe Theismann, Paul McGuire, and Susie was doing sidelines. So I used to see Susie every Sunday before the game down on the field, and we'd sit and talk for a few minutes. Trust me when I tell you, she knows as much NFL football as anybody, male or female. It doesn't make any difference. She studied football. She knows the NFL. There's no look at me, look at me, look at me. She does her job, and she does it very well.
Yeah. There's also some controversy. It really surfaced the last 3 or 4 years, particularly with the kneeling thing with the national anthem. That's when it's taken front or center. And I'm not talking about that specific issue, but rather the sports media's reaction to it and how they cover it. And now we're seeing, especially on ESPN and larger media outlets, where on-air personalities, certainly analysts and commentators, are now, quote unquote, getting political. And there is certainly I think there's valid cases actually on both sides of this argument as to whether people want to hear sports announcers address social, political, cultural problems. A lot of people will say, "Hey, man, we want to watch the sports. Let's tune that out. Just give us the game. That's why we're here." And that's a valid point of view. I think you'd agree. However, there are others. Probably Bob Costas probably personifies this other side, which is, listen, some issues are so profound, so important, and sports being such a important part of North American culture, that we must speak out, or certainly we must address it and cover these issues. In other words, sports and politics are intertwined. What's your position on this, Howard?
Well, first of all, Costas, I believe, has just signed on fairly recently with CNN. So he's doing some commentary for CNN. I don't know of many times I've watched Jake Tapper on CNN or Wolf Blitzer or anybody else that works for cable news. I don't see any of them giving ball scores. So what I'm saying basically is, when you turn into sports talk radio, do you want to hear the host position on the president? Do you want to hear the host position on black? I don't think there's a place for it. And it's not that I'm walking away from it or turning a deaf ear to it. I grew up in Brooklyn. I have an advantage because I grew up in a melting pot. I grew up in a neighborhood where there were Irish, Italians, Jewish, Puerto Rican, blacks. We didn't care what color you were. We didn't care what nationality you were. We didn't care what ethnicity you had. As you could play ball, you were in. And that was the whole entree into where the guys that we hung around with. We used to play punch ball and stick ball in the street. We used to go across the street to the parade grounds of a field, play football. We had the schoolyard a block away. We'd go there, play basketball. As long as you could play, we didn't care what your background was, who you were, what you were, and so on. And I think that has helped me in terms of understanding, first in the late 60s, when in the late 60s, it was the turbulent time in our history. I never thought I'd see that again. Only what we're seeing now is worse. There's one big difference. Then it was blacks that were in protest. Now, Nolan, how many times have you seen a protest where half the protesters are white? You didn't see that back in the 60s.
We're now in the age of sports and COVID. I mean, I never, who would have thought that would have been a question or a sentence that anybody could construct 6 or 8 months ago. And here we are with games and no spectators. I'll ask your prediction on that, although it's almost a ridiculous question to predict what's going to happen with these pro sports leagues. But let's just talk about, for a second here, put that question on hold. I'm kind of buttering you up for the closer because I like your projections on that. And in the meantime, I'd like you to reflect on what you've seen in terms of broadcasting with no fans and using artificial I guess, crowd noises and things like that. We're seeing a very different kind of broadcast product, sports product now than before. Do you like it or not? And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, obviously, I prefer to see fans, obviously. But I had Jim Nance on my podcast just before the first golf tournament that CBS put on without fans. Um, and he knew it was going to be tough. But Jim's a pro. And he can handle it with the best of them. So I watched and listened to his first day on the first golf tournament on a Saturday. And Jim was still Jim. He didn't miss the crowd because, let's face it, the gallery at a golf tournament is not the story, except when Tiger Woods is in the field and they have huge crowds. But with Jim, it wasn't a problem. A friend of mine, Mike Breen, does the national telecast for ESPN and also does the Knicks. And I watched Mike. He and Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson are in Orlando in the bubble doing the game for ABC and or ESPN. They had missed a beat. The crowd noise not being there doesn't seem to bother them. They know what they're doing. They're doing their job. They're doing it well. And we're getting to see live sports. In baseball, a little different. It's a little strange, to be honest, because I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if baseball pulled the plug on the league sooner than later, because too many athletes are opting out, and too many athletes are being tested for the COVID, and I'm fearful that they're going to pull the plug on that. I don't sense that in the NBA. Football, who knows? They don't start. I believe they've just started to go to training camp, so we'll see how that all develops. But I don't know. I guess we're going to go through it one way. It's difficult. How about the announcers? As an example, I had Al McCoy on, who's the longest-running NBA announcer. He works for the Phoenix Suns since 1972.
Wow.
And Al's calling the Phoenix Suns games now off a monitor in Phoenix while they're playing in the bubble in Orlando. He said he's never done that before. But he's a pro. He'll handle it.
Wow, yeah. So you just addressed it a little bit, the four major pro sports leagues, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and NFL. If Major League Baseball pulls the plug, as you say, does that perhaps influence what the NFL does later? If they say, hey, listen, it's the same rough number of players, same kind of a situation, although it's travel every 4 or 5 days in baseball. The bubble systems in NHL and NBA are a bit different, but the NFL teams would have to travel. So that's more analogous to the baseball situation. So baseball, if they cancel or whatever, suspend, I don't know the right word there, that could influence the NFL, yes or no?
I don't think it'll have an impact. I really don't. I think the NFL stands by itself. They've lost a ton of money, like all the leagues have. I sense that they'll play, although I would like to see them have a system where, let's just say the NFC East, they play in one place. All the games of the NFC played in one place. Same with the NFC North, same with the NFC South and the West and so on, to cut down on the traveling, because I think that's a big problem. But they'll figure it out. You know what's going to happen in the business you're in. The first time the ball's kicked in the air, how many bets are going to be made?
Oh, the bets are already there.
And that's what it's about.
Flying in, sure. In fact, New Jersey set a record, I think, in baseball its first 4 or 5 days. There was nothing to bet on. Then all of a sudden you've got, games. So if people want to gamble, they want to watch, but they also want to gamble. You're certainly right. And that really influences, I think, it's all about the green, right? Let me just give you a little quick story and get your final thoughts on this. I had Teddy Covers last week on, and he said something that I thought was very profound. He said that if the NFL cancels its season or there's no football this fall, he said it's not going to be about sports in the sense that we shouldn't have to worry about missing football, or we can't make a bet, or we can't play fantasy sports. If that happens, he said, we got much bigger problems than just football. We got some serious problems, because if the plug is pulled on this monster, with what it means to this country, to the people in it, to those who largely make their schedules based around Sunday and certainly Monday night. We got some serious problems on the horizon. So the NFL could be just that gigantic barometer of, how do I say it, this country's health. Is that an overstatement, you think?
No, I think it's accurate. I think it's fair. Look, we are in something that we've never seen before. And because of that, this is all new territory. We don't know how to react to a lot of things, but we're learning. And as long as people pay attention and pay attention to the positives as well as the negatives, when you see people go into bars in Florida and people come out and how many are affected and you still haven't learned right from wrong, then you're never going to learn right from wrong. So listen to what the doctors are telling you. Listen, I'll repeat. Listen to what the doctors are telling you. And anybody else has no idea. The Faucis of the world, pay attention. There's a Gupta who's on CNN. I see him frequently. Listen to what they're telling you. This is a whole different territory, Nolan. You know that is better than I. So we'll get out of this. It's going to take some time because it's not going to happen overnight. And if and when they develop an actual vaccine, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to be free and clear from that moment on. It's still going to take time.
Good final words, some good advice from Howard David, a good friend, a fine man, one of the best that I've ever heard or seen in broadcasting. Howard, thank you for being my guest. For those who would like to hear more, particularly of your interviews on Twitch and follow you on social media, would you mind providing that information to us, Howard?
Yeah, it's twitch.tv/Howard David Live.
Got it.
And that's the way to get it.
We'll put a link up there as well. And also be sure and follow Howard on Facebook. You'll be hearing from him in the future, I'm sure, calling some, bad beats. By the way, you've called some bad beats that I was screaming back at you, sir, a few times. But as I was driving around and listening to football games. But I didn't want to bring that up until the end. Anyway, Howard David.
Always good.
Thank you. Nice to have you with us.
Always good.
We're not. We made it through. We made it through 45 minutes without talking over each other. Now I'm just rambling on. I'll let you say your goodbyes, and I'll say a final word, Howard.
I appreciate it, Nolan. It's always good seeing you, my friend.
Thank you so much. I'm Nolan Dalla with Slapshot, brought to you by Pointspreads.ca. We had Howard David with us. Really a fun time. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time. Good night.